This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 60th version of the eVTOL Flight Test Council. For those of you who are not familiar with this council, we are all about best practices for flight testing and certifying any kind of electric and vertical takeoff aircraft. Any kind of thing that touches on flight test is our interest. We have a very special topic today. And so unlike our usual meetings where we have lots of conversation going back and forth, in this particular case, we're going to go ahead and ask everybody to be quiet unless you absolutely feel you have to speak up because there's a lot to cover. I got 1 hour to do it, and we're recording this so that people can come back and watch it later. There's going to be a lot of fast talk here. And so what I want to do is just press on as quickly as we can. So with that short introduction, let me go ahead and get started on this. So this is a discussion about the taxonomy and lexicon for VTOL aircraft. And the reason we're having this discussion is because last fall, just in the last 6 months, a couple of things have happened that really grabbed our attention. And that, when I say our, I mean a lot of us, but especially myself and Dan Newman, who is a Boeing technical fellow. Dan and I have, and a lot of you know Dan's name because he writes the Coming to Terms article in the Vertiflight magazine. And in the most recent couple of articles, we've been talking about this taxonomy thing. And if you've seen the most recent article, you'll have seen a hint. This is the full-blown discussion of what is in that article and coming up in the next one. And so we've been working pretty tightly to derive all this. So Dan's a tech fellow, I'm an associate tech fellow at Boeing, and this is intended for public discussion and acceptance, but the discussion is going to have to be after the presentation. So we'll do that a little bit later. So what raised our alarms about this, what motivated us to do this was a few months back, the Europeans suggested redefining what a helicopter is. If it has more than 2 rotors, it's no longer a helicopter. That was our first alarm. And then the second thing of concern was when the FAA started talking about rules for operating powered lift aircraft, and which is all good and fine, but we start looking at the definition of powered lift and the taxonomy, and that's where this comes in. So with no further ado, we will get started on this. Okay, the prologue to this discussion here is that everybody should understand, right, that there's established categories for aircraft and classes for aircraft. They've been around for years and years, and they're pretty well documented, and they're listed out here. I'm not going to spend your time going over, but the point is they are established. Similarly, there's classes and categories for pilot privileges, pilot licensing. And they use some of the same language, but it's a little different class and category, so it's mixed, and people are often getting confused. It happens all the time. We're just making you aware that when you're talking classes and categories, be careful of what you're talking about because there's the 2 different kinds of standards. The next item here of discussion is on the CFR 142417B. And I think anybody who's dealing with certification is aware that what that is that's an option for an applicant to go to the FAA and say, hey, look, our aircraft doesn't fit in one of those regular categories or classes, and we need special treatment to get certified. And the FAA has accommodated people. And that's, for instance, if you go with a dirigible, you want to certify a dirigible, it would be under 2117B. And other kinds of aircraft. This is called special class. And so the beauty of special class is you don't have to use the established rule set, that box of rules or bucket of rules that's already exists. You can customize it. The problem with that is if everybody's hitting the FAA at once, which is about to happen here, then it gets really difficult to coordinate, to negotiate everything, and of course, all the other issues associated with that. So it'd be nice to have a consistent set. Certainly the FAA is trying to do that. What this effort is about helping everybody get an understanding of the taxonomy and the language so that we can go ahead and do exactly that. So that we can understand, oh, for this kind of aircraft with these features, it should have these standards associated. Now the rules themselves, the top level rules may not change, but how you show compliance to the rules is probably going to depend on the criteria. For instance, if your aircraft uses propellers to lift versus jets or rockets, we can imagine it's probably going to be some different test criteria or demonstration criteria. So we're trying to pull that together with the right kind of language. Okay, down on the bottom of this slide is talking about the taxonomy approach. Our basic approach here is to base the classification on the propulsor lift and cruise applications. right? So it's lift and cruise thrust, if you will. And we have to recognize that wings are really irrelevant to this low speed lift situation. When you're very low speed, wings don't matter. Of course, they can provide a spectrum of lift once you get into the cruise mode, but in terms of the fundamental vertical takeoff and landing capability, the wings are not really that irrelevant. So that's kind of a structural feature. All right, moving on. There's a list of FAA definitions that are out there. They're published all the time, and we're not going to go through it in any kind of detail, but I wanted to mention a couple things. First, the two items highlighted in yellow. So when you define an aircraft, an airframe, it talks about everything, but the key thing is if it's a rotorcraft, the certification includes the rotors. So the rotor is part of the package. It's not a separate part of certification. That's important. If you're a propeller aircraft, then the propellers are not part of the certification. Those are separate. They can be separately TSO'd, that's right. So that's an important distinction. If you want to go certify an aircraft, it's good to know whether or not you have a rotor or a prop. That's fair enough. And then jumping down at the bottom, there's a definition on a prop. And what it says, by the way, highlighted in yellow, is a prop is not a rotor. It is not a main rotor or what they call an auxiliary rotor. You know, and we know them as tail rotors or any torque devices. Okay, those are not propellers. They explicitly say that. So get that out there because that's going to affect our lexicon moving forward. Also, in these definitions for rotorcraft and gyrodynes and so forth, you see the word principally 3 times. So basically, it's leaving a little bit of wiggle room. For instance, let me just run through rotorcraft real quick. Rotorcraft means a heavier than air aircraft that depends principally on its port support in flight on the lift generated by one or more rotors. Principally leaves you some wiggle room. It could mean, well, of course, you reserve some of your power for stability and control and maybe keeping the aircraft going, but maybe there's some wiggle room for putting in, instead of a rotor, maybe a wing or part of a wing, as long as it's principally rotor, but it's not clearly defined. All right, that's done on purpose. Clearly, you don't put a word in like that accidentally, but of course, it opens things up to interpretation, and that's one of the things we're going to discuss. Okay, and notice in here, rotor is not defined. Now, rotor can be lots of things. It could be the brake rotors on my car or the rotors in an electrical generator. Of course, we're talking about aviation rotors, but there is no definition of aviation rotor, and that starts to matter. In the past, it really didn't because everybody kind of knew what a rotor was. But now that this new tech is showing up and starting to matter, we better sharpen our pencils. And that's part of the discussion. Okay, moving on. Let's jump into the taxonomy. Okay, the basic taxonomy starts off like this. On the far left side, we have variable thrust line possibilities. And on the far right at the top is in that little dash box, principally fixed thrust lines. So what that means is, if it's principally fixed thrust line, the thruster, the propulsor, is not moving, it's not tilting, it's not reorienting itself, it's basically fixed to the airframe. Okay, that's fair enough. So either principally fixed or they're designed to be variable thrust line. That starts off pretty easy. Oh, by the way, you should probably define what a propulsor is. Nothing exotic here. For our purposes, propulsor is a device that generates thrust. And we can use the thrust for lift, or for propulsion, or for control. Doesn't matter, it's basically a thrusting device. That's a propulsor. Okay, now, jumping into the first level of the taxonomy. Start off on the far right is that big box called lift. Okay, what we're talking about here is they're principally fixed in the lift direction. That's all they do is lift straight up and down. If your propulsors only lift straight up and down, the only way you can move forward is to tilt the entire aircraft to reorient your lift vector. Okay, that's fair enough. On the next to lift, in the middle there is cruise. And if it's a fixed propulsor fixed in the cruise direction, that's what it does. And of course, we're familiar with that with airplanes of all kinds. But this is a discussion about VTOL aircraft. So if it's vertical takeoff capability, the only kind of aircraft that can take off vertically with cruise is if it's an airship. If it's lighter than air in the first place, and the cruise just gets you moving forward. So that's kind of a trivial answer, but we're acknowledging, we're saying, okay, that is something, but we're going to go ahead and not talk about airships anymore, but that's where they would fit if we want to talk about. Okay, and then moving on to the far left side is the lift/cruise, and as you can imagine, that is a combination. It can do both functions, both the lift function and the cruise function in terms of variable thrust line. Simple enough, okay? Now, moving on, At the bottom of this, I mentioned these three are the primary ways you can set up propulsion systems. And you can think of these as they're akin to primary colors in a color wheel, red, yellow, and blue. They're the primary colors. And of course, just like in a color wheel, if you can mix the primaries together, you make compounds, compound colors, and that's what we have on this next slide. So the compounds are akin to secondary colors. All right. And as you can see from the graphic here, we're just putting the pieces together. And so we have these different things. Now, in the green text here, under the discussion of pure and thrust compound. So a lot of people in the rotorcraft business are very familiar with the term thrust compound, and that's what that means. You can have thrust from two different things. For instance, a thrust compound helicopter has a rotor and it has a pusher prop or some sort of pusher going along with it. So anything with a compound, you can see from here are those new items, and they're the ones with the little pluses. Pretty straightforward. If it's a plus, it's a compound. Well, what do we call the ones that are not compound, the ones that it's only one kind? The simple word we're just going to use here is pure. It's purely one kind, you're not compounded. Okay, that's easy. It just gives us some words to use. So that completes the first tier of the VTOL aircraft taxonomy. Everything fits here. Whatever you want to come up with is going to be one of these 6 basics. All right, now let's start on to the second tier. All right, let's take a closer look at the lift cruise. There's 3 fundamental ways you can do a lift cruise. On the far left here in this bottom little box is a tilt propulsor. All right, so you can take the propulsor and you can pivot it relative to the airframe, and that's of course how you can mechanize your lift cruise. On the far right side is when you vector the E-VTOL. And the vectoring can move it around, and you're not necessarily moving. In this case, you're not moving the propulsor; you're moving the E-flows. All right, and then in the middle there is a lift cruise wing, and this is where the wing itself is. It's not a rotor, and it could be a rigid or semi-rigid airfoil system, but it generates lift and forward thrust by its action relative. All right, that might sound a little bizarre, but we're trying to create a structure that encompasses all understandable possibilities of how to generate thrust. And I'll give you some detail in just a minute. All right, so if a lift cruise can be one of those 3, then anytime you use the lift/cruise idea, for instance, these 2 compounds next to it, well, the same 3 would show up over there, but they're compounded. So you get that plus the cruise component. So it's the same thing, and now we have it's multiplied. So that second tier has been multiplied. All right, so now we're done talking about this side. Let's go over to the right side of this sketch and say, let's take a closer look at the lift side. All right, now this is kind of a busy slide. It's going to take a minute to walk through it. Let's go ahead and talk about the 2 basic ways you can have pure lift. One is with a rotor, and oh, well, those are very common. That's rotorcraft. And in fact, the yellow box there signifies that it meets rotorcraft definition that the FAA has been using for years and years. So if it has a rotor for lift, and of course you tilt the entire rotorcraft to move around through the sky, there you go. That's what we're talking about. Next to the rotor is axial thrust. These are aircraft that are different than rotor, and the fundamental difference is over here on these big green letters in the definition. And this is where it starts to become important to have a definition for what a rotor is. So here's what we're saying. A rotor is a rotating airfoil with ability to control and direct thrust along and off its spin axis. And that's distinct from an axial thruster, which is a complete propulsion installation that generates force only along a single axis. That is a key distinction. So going back up over here to the top corner under lift, if it's a rotorcraft can tilt its disc right through the controls. And if it's a helicopter, you can use a cyclic control. In this picture right here, you can see a very simple gyroplane, in which case it doesn't have a cyclic, but you can tilt the hub, and the pilot can do that. So that's what defines a rotor, is your ability to tilt the thrust vector enough to pull the mast around, and then you're tilting the aircraft by pulling the mast around. That's different than axial thrust. In axial thrust, the only way to pitch it around is by differential thrust, or in some cases weight shift. If it's a really small aircraft, you can weight shift your way around. So those are the fundamental distinction of lift configurations. So we're putting that in. Now, in next to, or underneath the lift plus cruise category, also in yellow is rotor plus a cruise axial thrust. AT is just abbreviation for axial thrust. So that's a compound thrust helicopter, as a lot of you would know, and I'll give you some examples in a couple of minutes here, what specifically, but that's the idea. Your lift can be a rotor, and then your cruise is some sort of axial thrust device. And then next to that in white is, instead of a rotor for lift, it's some sort of axial thrust for lift. And then you also have the cruise, which is also axial thrust. So you have two kinds of axial thrust. The fundamental ways you can generate lift plus cruise. All right, now what has been left off of here, and jump your eyes to the bottom of this presentation, this slide here. Okay, what has been intentionally left off or reserved from this is reference to a fixed cruise rotor, meaning like a helicopter rotor that is fixed permanently in the cruise position. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to us. It doesn't seem viable. And so we're just try to clean up this taxonomy without getting, we decided to reserve it. Now, if somebody comes back and says, no, I've designed one and I've flown it and it really works great, then we'll add it back in. But we reserve that for now. Similarly, if you're going to have a lift rotor, you're probably not also going to combine a lift slash cruise device. It's just very complicated, doesn't seem necessary or viable. So again, we've marked those as reserved. Now, in that little gray box in the bottom, I've saved that note, making it clear we have intentionally reserved it, and it's in gray, and we're not going to talk about it anymore, but we're going to carry it as a reminder that that's something we've done with this taxonomy. Okay. Now, also on the second level there, jump your eyes back up to the second level, you can see some of these are in gray. The ones that are in gray are notionally possible, but we don't have any examples yet. But in the spirit of having robust taxonomy, we're trying to capture these kinds of things. So that's what we're looking at right now. So all the ones in black and black frame, we have examples I'm going to show you. The ones in gray, we don't. They're just notion. Okay, so that completes the second level. Well, I got one more thing to talk about on the second level, which is the names. We have names for some of these, and I mentioned that. Jumping over here, we have, under rotor, we have helicopter. And of course, a helicopter uses, you get a mast moment to tilt the helicopter. And then there's a thrust compound rotorcraft. But on the far right here, we don't have a name for aircraft that use axial thrust. And just as a handy name, it just makes sense. If it's an axial thrust aircraft, we can just call it an axicraft. So that's a first recommended term we want to use here. Well, we have recommended definitions for rotor. And here's our first recommended term that we think would be very handy to use. So what is an axicraft? It's an aircraft that generates, all low-speed lift and horizontal propulsive thrust through one or more fixed lift axial thrusters. So they're fixed in the lift direction, and they're axial thrusters, they're not rotors. And notice how this definition says nothing about wings. Wings are not relevant here. So it could have a wing, it may not have a wing. This captures anything that basically doesn't have a rotor. So it's a pretty broad view. Now, it gets a little bit interesting. And the reason we start to get a little bit careful here is looking over here on the left side, there is the definition for powered lift. And I just wanted to highlight a key phrase in powered lift is powered lift aircraft relies on non-rotating airfoils for lift during horizontal flight. Okay, that's going to become important in a minute. And so we're going to hang on to that thought, and I'll show you where that applies. But what you're seeing right now, this is the top two tiers of the aircraft taxonomy, and there's only 3 tiers. So let me just keep pressing on, and we'll get to that third tier right now. So let's jump into the third tier, and what you just show up was that new set of blocks below the lift cruise. And here what we're seeing is the tilt propulsor. There's one of 2 ways to mechanize a tilt propulsor. It's a tilt rotor, and we're familiar with tilt rotor aircraft, or it's a tilt axial thrust. And that could be a prop or a jet or anything that creates the thrust in axial direction. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But there's basically two ways of doing it, tilting a propulsor. On the jumping over to the other side, the vector efflux, right? You can do that with vanes, deflection vanes. And typically that's something you associate with large flow of air. And then the other kind is vectoring the nozzle. So that, of course, that's typically with a jet engine or a rocket engine, you're vectoring the nozzle. So those are two different ways you can do that. And then in the middle is this discussion about a lift cruise wing. And being more specific, you can have an articulating wing or a cycloid wing, right? And again, we're trying to be very broad here to future-proof this taxonomy. A rigid wing, a lot of you know as an ornithopter. And what we're saying here is rigid wing is a rigid or semi-rigid airfoil system that changes air momentum via flapping or other motions. And so this little picture is a actual ornithopter hummingbird is flown. It has been mechanized. I'm not saying it's happened at scale. And anybody who's seen the movie Dune will recognize the giant ornithopters there, and that's kind of comical. But the point is we're trying to future-proof this taxonomy. A cycloid wing is been not around, the idea has been around for many years, as you can see from this black and white photo here. Not that this particular one flew, but some have flown, and I'll show some in a little bit. So cycloid wings, at least at small scale, have flown. They're viable, so they go into here. But what's new here, notice the color green in the background of the cycloid. This cycloid is a special category because it's not a rotorcraft. It doesn't spin like a rotor. Helicopter rotor, but it does spin. It's a turning wing, but it's not a rotor. And it's also not powered lift because it doesn't have a fixed wing. Let me jump back. So look at that highlight on the yellow there. Non-rotating airfoils. It relies on a non-rotating airfoil. A cycloid is a rotating airfoil. It's just not rotating in a rotorcraft direction. So the terminology, the definitions make perfect sense for a certain scope of aircraft, but they fall apart a little bit. It all depends on how picky or how exact we are trying to interpret this. So we're trying to get clarity, and that's on pointing out some of the deficiencies. So if you read it literally, a cycloid does not qualify as a rotorcraft, and it does not qualify as a powered lift. It's neither here nor there. That's why it gets green. So I'm building this legend here in the middle, showing what's happening. All right, so taking a look at those 6 at the bottom of the third level, once again, they would multiply on either side. So now we have 6 times 3. And once again, in gray are just the notional ones. I have no examples, but we're just trying to be robust here. So this is starting to flesh out the third tier. Now we move over to the right side for the next discussion. And we start off with, well, let's take a look at those arrow quivers, right? And in 3 different locations, we'll see these arrow quivers. And what that is intended to do, and it's down there in the little legend, the point of those arrows is to show that there is a spectrum of wing sizes you can put on these aircraft. You can have a classic helicopter over here in the upper right with no wing at all, which is what most helicopters are, that they would all fit under that arrow. In the center is some sort of wing, perhaps offloading the rotor a little bit. And okay, they've flown, and we have some examples of those. And then we have a helicopter with the wings so big that it starts to violate that literal interpretation of what a rotorcraft is, that depends principally on the rotor. If the wing is big enough that you don't need to depend principally on the rotor, now what do we call it? So this is a kind of a concern for us. It's like I can have a helicopter, and at some point I make the wing just big enough, and all of a sudden it clicks over, and now it's no longer a helicopter or rotorcraft. Now it's suddenly powered lift. That doesn't make a lot of sense to us if it's a full-up helicopter in its own right. But if we literally interpret the rule, the definition, we got sort of a problem. So the same thing with these 3 different arrow quivers show up for these other cases. Now, in the yellow box in the bottom, we have existing definitions that are perfectly fine for a windmilling rotor, which of course is a gyroplane. And if you have a powered rotor that's compound, then that's a gyrodyne, and there's an existing definition for that. And a lot of people know them as thrust compound helicopter. But again, they can have any size wing, from no wing, partial wing, or conceivably even a full wing. So this is where it starts to get interesting. Okay, so now to flesh this out a little bit, let's go ahead and take it to the next level. Let's put in some examples. This is we're putting this orchestra together of how all these pieces play. So with the prelude, let's just add some rotorcraft examples. Bam, here we go. They're all in yellow because they're rotorcraft. All right, now over here in the zero wing rotorcraft, there's so many examples of helicopters that we're not even bothering with them. There's just so many of them. But what I did do is just give a quick sample of the kinds of configurations. You can have a one rotor, a concentric rotating, counter-rotating. You can have mesh, you can have tandems, you can have transverse, you can have multi-copters, 3+ multi-copters. All kinds of options are out there. You can have rotorcraft with some stub wings or partial wings. Boeing Vertol 347 did this, the MBB 105, the Sikorsky S-67 did this. So there's examples out there of aircraft that have done this. And similar, we have powered rotors and windmilling rotors. Here are some example aircraft. And we don't have time to run through it all, but it's all in the presentation. You can, of course, we're going to share this widely for everybody to look at in detail later. All right, now let me throw in the first curveball. Okay, we have an exception already. And wind back the clock 100 years. And you take a look at aircraft like the Sierra C6, or shortly after that, the Pitcairn PA-18. Those nice, pretty pictures up in the corner. These rotors, these very early rotors, did not have any kind of off-axis thrust control. They had ability to flap and to lead lag, but that's it. There was no way to control the rotor disc as we understand it today, is what you do with a helicopter or a rotorcraft. So that's why you look at that black and white picture and you see on that spar 2 giant ailerons, because that's how you control the aircraft. And on the back tail end, you have elevator, and then there's a rudder back there too. That wasn't where you got your control from. It wasn't from the so-called rotor. And a few years later, the Pitcairn 18, same thing. You have a conventional tail, you have semi-conventional wings that provided the control, but the rotor itself didn't do anything. So this is a primitive example. Now, this was considered a rotorcraft at the time, 100 years ago, but it's not, I don't think, and this is where we need clarity from the regulators. If I was to come out today and try to sell this as a rotorcraft, would that be a viable rotorcraft, or is that not considered a rotor anymore? So that's a question. But in the meanwhile, while we settle that question, we just need a name to call this thing. And so what I proposed here is here in green. Basically, a flat rotor. And the definition of a flat rotor is it's a rotating airfoil with provisions for edgewise flow and ability to generate force only along its spin axis. So it starts with something like this. But of course, if you think about a typical helicopter tail rotor, that does not have a cycle. It has an ability to handle edgewise flow. It can flap, it can pivot or teeter, but it doesn't have collective control, or it doesn't have a tilt hub and that sort of thing. So a conventional tail rotor would qualify as a flat rotor. So we have putting this forth as just part of our lexicon, so we have a better way to capture what it is we're talking about. Is it a proper rotor with an ability to move the disc around? What my colleague Dan Newman put out in the last issue of Vertiflight magazine, in his definition of rotor, he was more specific. He said it has cyclic control to do that. Well, I think that's perfectly good for a helicopter, but if it's one of those simple gyroplanes that Andre of Transport Canada pointed out, thank you, Andre, that also qualifies as a rotor in the eyes of certification officials. So we should just worry about the fact that it is an ability to tilt the disc. But these do not have that. So probably we can say those are not proper rotors, but there's some kind of rotor. So the term flat rotor just makes sense. It kind of falls out. So I'm putting that out there. So these now, we are grandfathered in as rotorcraft because they're very primitive, and we can accept that. That's not a problem. Let's drop those in on the examples, and there they show up in green. So the very earliest ones, those were, I refer to them as flat rotors. So they're not confused with tilt head or cyclic rotors or other mechanisms. Okay, so now we go to the next question. The next question is, what if you have a full wing? Now what happens? And again, getting back to that powered lift definition, remember I highlighted that before. Here it is again. Non-rotating airfoils. If you're on cruise flight, if you're living off of your fixed wing instead of your rotor, if you strictly interpret what the powered lift definition is, these three red question marks on the other side, it looks like now by the letter of the law, it looks like they become powered lift. Just by making the wing just that 1 square inch too big, now all of a sudden they switch. That doesn't make a lot of sense to us. We think that's something to challenge. And we have a very simple way to get around it that we want to propose, but that's kind of a thing. And so that's coming up in just a minute. But examples of this is these aircraft. So there's the Boeing Heliwing, which was on the front, there's an image of it on the opening slide of this presentation. And I don't want to slow down and go back and show you that right now, but it's there on the opening slide. Of course, you can find it online. And then in the middle there is a couple of what are colloquially known as stop rotor aircraft. Sikorsky S-72 and the Boeing X-50. Now, neither one has been successful, but they have been built and we've attempted it, and it is an idea that maybe it will continue. So just to put a handle on it, just to put a name on these, what I've called them is CWG, Cruise Wing Gyrodynes. All right, and then this Boeing Heliwing is a helicopter tail sitter, so you can just push that together if you want and call it a helisitter. It's just a handy name to make it for quick reference. All right, so this is something, but you can see I haven't highlighted it in yellow because as we interpret this, or as we don't interpret it, as we take the letter of the law of how the definition is written, I can't call that a rotorcraft. Now, this is a concern for me as a flight analyst DER representative of the FAA. I am not allowed to interpret rules. That is, I am allowed to enforce rules on behalf of the FAA. I don't get to interpret. So I don't get to say, oh no, I'm going to call that a rotorcraft because I think it is. No, that's not my place. But we do need to have that conversation from the regulators to understand what to really do this. But we sincerely think there's a solution through this, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so now we're going to cue the orchestra and add lots of examples of aircraft that meet the existing powered lift definition. That's how most people understand powered lift, and blam, we got a lot. And a lot of these are in the, a lot of you may have seen before in the famous VFS wheel that a lot of work went into a generation ago to go ahead and put that together. So a lot of that fits, everything in that wheel fits here. They're all mentioned somewhere. And it's all kinds of arrows and circles and all this showing where this all fits. And I've fleshed out the legend to complete that. So what we see in this is a pretty good start, but we have a few exceptions. But now with the crescendo here, we're going to add examples that don't qualify as rotorcraft or powered lift, okay? And that's what I mentioned earlier was the axicraft. Those are the ones that are pure axial thrust that don't have wings. If they don't have wings and they don't have rotors, then they don't qualify as either, and that's these over here on the far right side. We got a whole list of these, and this list is growing. This just gives you an example of what's out there. Some of them are propellers, some are fans, some are rockets, some are flap rotors. The flap rotor probably bears special mention all the way at the bottom corner. That's the common cargo. And so we're talking about what is largely like a bunch of tail rotors wrapped around in a circle, but they're not fixed propellers. They seem to flap. I don't know the tech behind it in exactitude, but I'm pretty sure there's some version of a flap rotor. We can add some language saying, hey, look, if you only have one device, it's a mono thruster, and if you have more than one, it's a multi-thruster. And if the thrusters are spinny things, rotors, or perhaps props, we call them multi-copters. But that's a subset of multi-thrusters because it could be multi-jet or multi-rocket or something else, and you wouldn't call that a multi-copter. So multi-thruster is just sort of a broader thing. Okay, so that captures a fair amount, but wait, there's more. We get an encore. We're going to add some examples here that don't qualify as rotorcraft, they don't qualify as power lift, and they don't qualify as axicraft. They just don't fit anywhere. And that's what some of these pictures are. We have on the far left, we have a cycloid with a prop in the back for lift. We have a pure cycloid next to it, and then we have these other aircraft that have been around for some years. And on the far right is the Aurora Goldeneye, my company. That example sits about 20 feet from my desk, and that has flown. So there's these aircraft that don't fit anywhere, and let's put those in, and they show up over here in various places over on the left. So what we have now is this taxonomy that captures everything, but what you can see is the ones in white are ostensibly powered lift, and the ones in yellow are rotorcraft, and the ones in green are neither. So here is a key point. The term power lift does not capture all the possibilities that are out there. As defined today, as viewed, and again, my job as a DER is to not reinterpret the law, it's to see it how it is. And this is what I'm seeing, is it is not inclusive, it is not comprehensive enough. And that's a concern. We want to raise that concern up to everybody. But this, what you're looking at here is what we're proposing basically is how to set up taxonomy structure. Pretty much everything fits in here. And if we wanted to, we can even drill down and talk about airships, but that's pretty much all out of scope here. So this slide here, slide number 25, is the key one. Now I'm going to go ahead and keep going. We still have a bunch more slides to talk about. But this gives you the 3 levels, the 3 tiers of the taxonomy, and all these different examples showing you how things fit. And now we're going to jump into a summary of this. Okay, so what we're recommending is if you want to describe an aircraft, you describe it at the lowest level, unless you're trying to intentionally be broad. You can say, well, it's a rotorcraft, or it's a lift plus cruise aircraft, or it's a power lift. Yes, you can do that, but it's probably more accurate just to describe it at the lowest level. Now, one of the recommendations we're making is, is established definitions, where we're using the established definitions for helicopter, gyrodyne, gyroplane. That all, we're not trying to rock the boat here, but we do have a recommendation for understanding what a rotorcraft is, to capture everything in that quiver. It's down here in that bottom in that orange box. I think we can capture those if we look at a very large wing, or a cruise wing, if you will, on a helicopter. We can bring that into the fold of simple rotorcraft with 3 letters, 1 word, all right? And the basic definition is there in gray. Rotorcraft means a heavier than air aircraft that can depend principally for its support on flight on the lift generated by 1 or more rotors. So if you don't need the wing, but you have one, then it's still a rotorcraft. I think by doing that, we allow everything under that quiver to be yellow. I mean, back up. Everything there, the helicitters and these can all be yellow, and that's what we're recommending, because it's just a spectrum. There's nothing significant in our view that should all of a sudden turn these things into powered lift and make them jump from one category to another. So this is an interpretation suggestion without changing the letter of the law. We know that's difficult to do. But if we can agree that something like this interpretation, perhaps there's a better idea, then we're good. All those rotorcraft are accepted. All right, the other, getting back up to line 2 here, new configuration definition to fill that void. I mentioned axicraft, so that was discussed. Now, for the combinations where you're using the lift or cruise, if it's a rotor, we already have names. We have names for lift devices that use rotors, the helicopters, gyroplanes, everything. They exist. So we can just sort of say, hey, if it doesn't already have a name, then you can assume the lift is axial thrust. So we can just sort of tighten up the language. We can assume that this pure application, it's pure lift, it's pure tilt rotor. You don't have to say pure unless you specifically say it's compound. So defaults to pure. And then the compounds. And nothing here should be very surprising to anybody. So jumping down into some examples for a compound. Lift plus cruise. Hey, that looks familiar. If it's lift plus tilt axial thrust, because remember, it could be a tilt rotor, but here we're saying tilt axial thrust. It could be a lift plus cycloid, like that little example. It could be a lift plus vector thrust. It can be a tilt axial thrust plus cruise. You have different combinations. So there's a very concise way of capturing things, and you can capture them at the narrowest level, or you can work your way up in the tiers as desired. As an optional fourth level description, without complicating anything, we can just say, if you want to describe your aircraft down to a fourth level, that's the propulsor count. So example here is I have 8 lift devices and 2 cruise devices, or propulsors, if you will. Okay, so without adding any complication, you just kind of drop that in. And once again, over here in the bottom corner on the left, as a reminder, what's been reserved? We're reserving fixed cruise rotors and fixed lift rotors compounded with lift cruise devices. Those just don't make a lot of sense, so we kind of set those aside. All right, now, if that our recommendation is not accepted and the regulators insist on enforcing it as written, what that does is it introduces problems into, voids, if you will, into the category. So let me back up a little bit, 2 slides. So we originally proposed that aircraft like the Sikorsky and the Helisitter would fit under, well, the Sikorsky, the cruise wing gyrodynes would fit under gyrodynes. But if the regulators say, no, they have wings, they cannot be gyrodyne, they cannot be rotorcraft anymore, they have to be powered lift, well, then they fall outside of that box. We need a new box for the classification. So in that case, what we do is, all right, we generate a new box over here just for the ones that have that big wing. And you'd have to do it for this kind of gyrodynes. You'd have to do it for helicopters because they need it, and you'd have to do it for the axicraft if you put a big wing on axicraft. So now we have to introduce more categories if there is no flexibility in the interpretation. This is not what we're recommending, but it would be a workaround, if you will. Okay, and here's some suggested definitions if we need to go this way. One is a Helisitter. A Helisitter is an aircraft with wings that lift enough. We don't know what that is yet, but they lift enough to qualify as a powered lift aircraft. An axisitter is the same thing. It's an axicraft with wings that are big enough. And then this other term is, we just pulled this out as a combination. If it has a rotor plus a cruise wing, just calling it RCCW now as a, and again, it's the same thing. It's that mechanism with a wing that's big enough to lift. We don't know what that threshold is, but that would be something that would need to be part of the conversation if our recommendation doesn't go forth. But our recommendation is really, of course, what we're trying to push. If we end up doing that, the examples don't move, nothing moves, except we just added those new boxes up on the third tier. Okay, so now we're going to emphasize, shift gears a little bit, emphasize what is the weakness here with the powered lift discussion. So their powered lift definition is repeated here in italics. And by the way, the FAI defines convertiplane. It's basically as a subset of powered lift. They say, well, it's a powered lift aircraft that uses a rotor for vertical, and then it converts. That's not how I think of convertiplane, but that's out there. I just wanted to get everyone's attention. So the situation with these definitions for rotorcraft and powered lift is they clearly distinguish rotorcraft from the convertiplanes, and they made perfect sense for V-22s and Canadair CL-84s to help us understand the difference. But in case you hadn't noticed, it's not required for the taxonomy. Look back, the white ones fit as powered lift, but we don't need power lift anywhere in those top 3 tiers. It doesn't really come into play. So it's a term that captures these white aircraft, these examples in white, or the basic, but there's no necessity to call anything in particular powered lift as far as the taxonomy is concerned. So it doesn't really help us, is what I'm trying to say. So if we want to talk about, we give it a name for capturing all of these VTOL aircraft that are outside of the lighter than air, right? We're not going to worry about dirigibles. And rotorcraft are already captured nicely, thank you very much. We don't need to mess with them. But we want to try to capture something, a name that captures all the VTOL capable aircraft. So if we're not going to redefine the powered lift, and I don't know how we can reinterpret it, and it's a big deal to redefine things. So perhaps what we need is a new word. And here's an idea. How about we use the word verticraft? Verticraft means heavier than air, non-rotorcraft capable of vertical takeoff and landing. In other words, it's VTOL, but we're scratching out LTA and we're scratching out rotorcraft because they're already covered. It's the catch-all for everything else. If it helps to have a term like that, then the FAA and the regulators, when they're talking about pilot licensing or operations, maybe powered lift isn't quite right because it's not comprehensive enough. Once again, all those things in green are not captured by the powered lift definition. So either they formally help us revise a definition, you reinterpret it, or we just use another word to capture what we really mean. So that's where we're going. Okay, I have 11 minutes left, and now I'm going to jump very quickly into digging a little deeper into this lexicon. Now, the taxonomy, as you've seen it, is all about the configuration and it's how things are set up. But we could add a little bit more granularity by discussing a little bit deeper what types of propulsors there are in terms of the axial thrust propulsors. The rotors, those are clear. Those are rotors or cycloids or ornithopters. Those lift cruise things. But the axial thrust types, let's describe it. Now, in terms of presenting this or capturing that information, we could describe it as I've done on this example. We back up, look at each one of those examples, and little square brackets is some detail about how it's mechanized. So we could just list it that way. That's one option. So we can do it this way and we're done. But there's some other options too. One is to put it in a more two-dimensional matrix. And another one is to, whoops, let me jump ahead, 2D matrix. And then option C is to invent a whole new graphic to replace the wheel. And I'm going to show you B and C. I've already shown you A. Let's go ahead. But whatever we do, we need some a simple taxonomy for axial thrust aircraft. And here it is all in one picture. Okay, all in one picture, we can see what aeronautical propulsors are. At the top level, there's two basic kinds. There on the far right, there's those that work in a vacuum, and they could be rockets or ion engines or nuclear pulse. And I know a lot of this doesn't have anything to do with aviation, but again, we're trying to be very broad here. Right, so there's vacuum engines, and there have been rocket engines. And there were examples. I have an example in here of a rocket engine vertical takeoff aircraft. So it's not like it's completely impossible. And then, of course, the vast majority are work air. They change the momentum of air, and those split into two categories. Going down in the next tier down, there is the hot jets, right? Ones that actually combust the air. You mix fuel with air, you compress it, you mix fuel and you burn it. That's hot jets. And then there's the cold propulsors, which is basically taking ambient air and pushing it without really cooking the air, without working it that way. So there's cold propulsors and hot jets, and as you can imagine, that makes a difference when it comes to certification and all the rules. Yeah, those are kind of significant. So we should probably talk about that. If you're going to set a box of standards, established standards, it probably matters whether it's a cold propulsor or a hot jet. Now let's take it down another level. Going back to the hot jets, if you wanted to, you can say, well, hey, we can break that down into those that use turbine compression. It could be turbojets, turbofans, or it could be straight compression like ramjets, scramjets, pulse jets. Again, I'm not saying everything needs to be included, but we're just trying to paint the picture of a taxonomy. Now, moving over here to the cold propulsors, we have propellers, and they can be fixed pitch or variable pitch. We have fans, and then we have the flap rotors that I had mentioned earlier. And flap rotors really, as discussed so far, they really don't fit anywhere else. They're clearly not propellers because they're not allowed to be propellers. They're not fans. They have this different sort of definition. So I'm keeping that, but we want to discuss that with everybody to see if it has value in the team. And then on the other side, in that purple box, is those propulsors that have off-axis thrust capability. We already have names for those. There's rotor wings, cycloid wings, articulating wings. Those are covered. So in that dashed blue box is all of these 18 types. So that is a list of things that you can do. So if you wanted to mash these together, this list with the previous taxonomy, it would look something like this. All right, here we have across the vertical axis, we have the configuration taxonomy. Across the top, we have the propulsor taxonomy. And blacked out are things that are not viable. They're not possible according to the definitions. And then the grayed out areas are ones where I don't have it, but there's lots and lots of examples in very deep. But these are just some sample examples of what we have. if the regulators do not accept our recommendations for broadening the understanding of what a rotorcraft is, we'd have to add a few more categories over here. It gets a little bit bigger, but it's the same idea. All right, now we're getting into the final strokes of this talk, and I got the last 6 minutes, and I'm going to use them all. So one of the things it is time to do is to replace that venerable wheel, the famous VFS wheel that everybody loves. The limitation of it is it should become apparent as you look more and more at this. It doesn't capture everything, and it's structured a little differently than ours. So if we wanted to replace it, and of course across the top of the top 3 tiers in this, just I cut and pasted that image. Well, obviously the initial idea is you can just bend this around into a hexagon, have both ends touch, and it would look just like this. It's the same everything, it's just wrapped differently. And that could be a presentation for it. It captures everything. Now, of course, there's a fair amount of repetition. As I discussed earlier, you can have this whole idea of articulating and cycloid and so forth, and they repeat and they show up in patterns. So that's one way of doing it. But Dan Newman came up with a really clever proposal, and it starts like this. It begins with these 3 triangles, and each one is a different pure application: pure lift, pure cruise, or pure lift plus cruise. And they're divided by the solid lines, and they're distinguished the pure applications, the basic applications. Okay, and so the colors, by the way, they're not necessary. You don't need these; they just help your eyeballs see what's going on, and you'll see that in a minute. But so it's pretty simple. There's these basic ways of setting up pure lift and lift plus cruise. Now let's just take it to the next level. Let's do the compounds. Show up the compound, bam, there they go. So all of these little parallelograms that are the intersections, those are the compounds. And everything fits in there. And what you're looking at here is this very same, it's just a different presentation that was on the linear version. So this is pretty cool. It's pretty slick, and on a graphic you can see. But the real beauty of Dan's idea is you don't see all the repetition that we had. Let me back up to, we had all this repetition going around, and it all made sense because you're multiplying an option in different ways. But with this, it very cleverly compresses it. So that's a pretty slick little idea. So graphically, visually, it's pretty interesting. Now, what we can do is take this and put in the examples. Right? And I've changed the colors. This is actually Dan's sketch here. And Dan went through all the work of adding a count of how many different aircraft fit in each one of these categories and each one of these spaces, if you will, whether it's a parallelogram or a trapezoid or whatever. And so we can see all kinds of different existing known features. You know, 2 of them fit here, 1 of them fits here, and so forth. And the color coding tells us something. The yellow ones are rotorcraft, according to FAA definition. The white ones are powered lift, and the green ones are neither, just like we've been doing. So this kind of, again, shows you a little differently the same thing. You can plot any particular aircraft anywhere you want in this triangle, anywhere it's appropriate in this triangle. Everything fits somewhere. And you can add it to the stack of ones that already existed. So there's 115 that Dan assembled to put into here to illustrate what's going on. All right. So in the last minute or two, I just want to talk a little bit more about the triangle and what we can do to customize it. So what we can do is we can add a little bit more granularity. Added some dash lines here, and now within the dash lines, you can see some granularity added. Remember I mentioned maybe we care about the difference between hot thrust, cold thrust, and vacuum engines. There we go. We can drop that in, just separated by dash lines. A little bit of extra granularity. And we can do it over here as well, and I added actually a little bit more granularity yet. Turbo fans and turbo jets and so forth. This is an option. It's adding extra bit of dimension, that propulsor dimension into this to just add a little bit more detail. So that is an option that we can work with. We can also say, hey, let's scratch out the ones that we don't think are viable. So I just grayed out those ones that we talked about before as being unviable. We can do that. And you can say, you know what? I don't really want to talk about, well, actually, hey, we can add gradients to it and have different shades of everything to help visually interact. That's all cosmetics, but it's just stuff that we can do with this. What we can also do is we can de-scope it. We can say, look, I don't care about articulating wings or vacuum engines. Let's just scratch those out. Okay, the border just, we just scratch them out. You say, well, I don't care about cycloids or straight compression. Let's scratch those out. Okay, now that's out of the conversation. But that's the flexibility of this. And of course, if new devices are invented, we can add new layers to this. But it's all hinged on the idea that you can have up to 2 combinations. The triangle works if you have 2 combinations, but if you get crazy and start having multiple combinations of this, that, and the other thing, then this is just completely out of scope and it's untenable. So this only works for things that exist and things that we know. Okay, so the epilogue here in my last minute is this. These are the ongoing discussions that we need to have. Again, one is with the CFRs, and there is no definition of rotor. So once again, is the proposed definition of rotor. Let's get that out there. Let's see if we can all agree that that makes sense. Number 2 is this proposed definition of a flap rotor. And at least as descriptive terms, even if it's not formally recognized as a definition or something, but it gives us a way to talk about it. But I think it fits in the taxonomy, I personally do. Next, number 3 is if we do use the flap rotor, should it join the lexicon? So I mentioned that. Number 4 is the interpretation of rotorcraft. Can we simply insert the word can in the definition of rotorcraft, and when we interpret it, to capture winged, fully winged rotorcraft? Is that okay? And that cleans things up for us. Number 5, if only a strict rotorcraft interpretation is allowed, so very strict, no number 4, then we get back to that word principle. Now we have to refine that. Well, at what point is principally principle? Is it half wing size? Is it 50% lift from the wing? Is it 3/4 wing lift? Where do we draw the line? That's a discussion. And then number 6 is it helpful to use a word, insert a word like verticraft to capture everything that powered lift does not? So that is thrown out there for consideration. And with that, I'm straight up high noon, and I will go ahead and stop sharing. And now we can open the